Hey, so I want to give you an overview, putting everything together that we've talked about, um, to see how that is actually going to come together to create um, how we speak and how we understand things. So let's take a look. We've got different levels of a word. We've got conceptual, then lemma, then lexeme, then articulation. So the conceptual is kind of just like the emotion that you want to convey, something that pops into your head before you even attach any sort of language to it. Something is there. You want to say hi to somebody, but you haven't yet accessed those words of like hi. You just like see another person, and then there's an emotion of like, I'm going to greet them. And so that's the conceptual level. There's a concept that exists um, inside your head somewhere. Then we're going to move down to the lemma. I say move down. I conceptualize this kind of like it looks on your screen, top down, like that. Like here's the most conceptual, and then as we move down, it becomes the most concrete. Um, Probably it's actually moving a little bit more if you're thinking about it in the brain. It's moving from front to back and yeah, front to back and just slightly down. Um, Front to back and then to the probably basal ganglia after that. Well, front to back, so you've got conceptual in the frontal lobe, lemma, mm, probably uh, in the frontal lobe, Broca's area type kind of thing. Then you're going to go to basal ganglia and motor strip, and then it's going to go down the spinal cord. So it's not as well organized uh, in the brain um, for understanding purposes. Anyway, I think about it from top to bottom like that. So we talked about conceptual. Lemma is you're going to have a language tag that's associated with the concept. So you're starting to come up with the idea of a word that you're going to use. You're not yet exactly like pulling up phonetic information, but you're getting like the notion of the word that you're going to throw into this context. So this is still kind of in the word selection phase. Like you're getting the notion. You have these lemmas. A lemma is a notion of a word. So you're selecting the lemmas. That's going to include things like the syntax of the word. So you know what kind of word it's going to be, and you know about how you need to change that word to fit it into the sentence that you're trying to make. So things like what kind of is it a verb? Is it a noun? What kind of exact morphology of it do you need? Do you want to use a synonym because that means a little bit more of the exact flavor that you want to give the sentence? Things like that. Then it's going to move to lexeme. This is the pre-articulatory phonetic form of the lemma. So the lemma is the notion, and now we've moved to I'm going to say uh, hi. So instead of hello. So you've moved to like, I know what I'm going to say. It's the pre-articulatory form, but you know what it's going to be. Then that goes to uh, the articulators, actually goes, if you've taken any of the other classes from me, and I'm sure any of the other instructors talk about it in the same way, but it goes then to the source filter model. So it comes from, you got your power source from the lungs, which is going to create air flowing through the vocal folds. That's your sound source. So you got power source, which is respiration, sound source at the vocal folds, phonation. Then resonance to create the actual speech sounds and articulation to chop up those speech sounds. So that's when you're going to move from lexeme to actually saying the words. So that's the levels of our word. So Broca's aphasia. Let's talk about just specifically Broca's aphasia here. Um, if you remember from either 205 or 310. Some of you haven't taken that because this class is not doesn't have those as prereqs. So we've talked about it a little bit in class, but essentially any sort of damage to this spot in the brain that you can see right here that's lit up on this picture of the brain, stroke, traumatic brain injury, tumor pushing on this area, any of these things, any kind of damage to the lateral posterior frontal lobe. So lateral, it's out on the sides. Posterior, it's towards the back of the frontal lobe, which is in the front. So this is pretty much what you see right here. Speech production is going to be impaired by this kind of aphasia, Broca's area, speech production, Broca's aphasia, impairment in speech production. And it's going to create what's called a non-fluent aphasia. So a non-fluent aphasia um, is it's not fluent. It doesn't flow really well. That doesn't mean that they don't understand what they're trying to say or that they don't understand the people that are communicating with them. They do, um, but it's not fluent because they can't get the words to actually come out. People with Broca's aphasia experience frequent and persistent effects that are somewhat similar to tip of the tongue state. It's not the same thing as tip of the tongue state, but I did have a student who, as a child, had a stroke, which there's a problem with his heart, which led to a stroke, which caused Broca's aphasia. And he said that it was a lot like when you're in tip of the tongue state. It felt the same to him, only it was a lot more often, and you wouldn't just have that moment where your tip of the tongue state resolves. He's fine now, by the way. He recovered from Broca's aphasia. A lot of work on his part, a lot of work on an SLP's part, and then also a bit of luck. Um, so that's great. So that's Broca's aphasia. Okay, so where does what moved a little too fast there? Where does Broca's aphasia come in to these to these levels of choosing a word, of selecting the words that we want for speech? Well, some things that we know is that a lot of people with Broca's aphasia show effects that are related to the size of a verb's predicate argument. That means how many different pieces of information you have to use to complete the sentence after you throw in a verb. So I jumped. That's a stupid sentence. I ran. That's a better sentence. Is just one predicate argument. I don't have to say I ran anywhere. I don't have to say I ran uh, someone. Like you can't say I ran someone. I could say I waved to someone or I kicked someone or something like that, and that then is two predicate arguments. Um, so I ran is a very simple argument. It's just one thing. Um, so what they're looking for here is reaction time. Um, Thinking about we see this in people who do not have Broca's aphasia when they're choosing words. They're faster to choose to say whether a sentence is grammatical or not if there is only one predicate argument. And people with Broca's aphasia are able to do that, and they're able to do it in the same way, will show the same kind of effects that we do. They get slower with verbs that have more predicate arguments. Also, people who have Broca's aphasia tend to have more issues with their aphasia with words that have more predicate arguments. So words that have only one predicate argument, there is not as much Broca's aphasia related issues with those. Words that have two have more. Words that have three have even more issues related with those. So it seems like there's a little something that's related in that case. But they still have access to this information about the word. So it's not like the syntax is also lost. They get the concept of the word before they can't go any further. Also, most people with Broca's aphasia have more trouble with verbs than nouns. There's a caveat to that that's really interesting, though. If it's a really concrete uh, verb, something that's related to a noun, something that's related to something that they can picture um, or remember using or anything like that, like to bottle something is related to the noun bottle. So there's a lot of visual information, procedural information that's available to them as well. Opening bottles, putting things in bottles, looking at bottles, drinking out of bottles, whatever. Um, they'll probably tend to have less Broca's aphasia related issues with those verbs than with things like to decide, which doesn't really have um, a noun related to it. Like what is a decide? Decision is a noun, but it's a not a concrete noun. Um, so that kind of shows that there is another effect there based on possibly syntax, based on possibly other types of information that's available to them. Whatever the case is, uh, these studies all show that they have access to information about the word. So what does that mean? Well, it looks like Broca's aphasia difficulties come in between lemma and lexeme. So there's not an ability to connect the lemma, the notion of the word, with the actual pre-articulatory form. So they have the concept, and they have like this notion of the word, like they know where they want to take this word. They kind of have the idea of it. They get, if they, of course, like we talked about a lot, if they speak a language where the word has a gendered, where the word has a gender, they know the gender of the word, just like people with tip of the tongue. And then that's it. The word doesn't come out. And so it seems like this trouble comes between lemma and lexeme. So it's not just a like conceptual thing that we're coming up with lemma and lexeme. It's actually, it has a real use. There's a reason why we talk about those. Um, it seems like, did I just jump over a slide here? No. So some evidence shows that this is where tip of the tongue effects come in as well. We know parts of speech, we know gender, we know synonyms, stuff like that. It also looks like there are when there are weaker lemma lexeme associations, not those don't exist between, like within certain words. That's like a person to person thing. So they might have, you know, there's words that you kind of like, you know of, but you can't really come up with a definition of them. This comes up a lot when you're playing games like Scrabble, and somebody will say like, I don't think that's a word. What does that word mean? And you're like, you know what? I know it's a word. I don't really know what it means. There's a weak lemma lexeme association there. And when you have a weak association between lemma and lexeme, more likely that you'll have a tip of the tongue state with that word than with a word that you're very familiar with. Now, it looks like that's probably where tip of the tongue comes in between lemma and lexeme again, so showing that there really is like real world consequences for things that are lemmas and lexemes. But we do also know phonetic information like first letter and the number of syllables. Now, this is getting closer to what you would think of as lexeme information, although this could be cues from things like writing or vision. So it's not like these words exist, you know, only inside our heads. And then that was a speech error that's going to come up in a second. It's not like these exist only in our heads. We write all these words down. We know how they're spelled. So it's not like we're just a culture that learns from hearing things and then saying things, and there's no written language. Everything has a written form. So it could be that we're pulling the first letter from visual associations with the same word. Some researchers think that that's probably what's happening because all of the other information shows that it's a disconnect between lemma and lexeme. Some researchers disagree with that. This is kind of still, uh, up for debate. Um, but it seems like possibly this is also where the distinction between, or the break between lemma and lexeme is where tip of the tongue states arise from. Okay, so what are the types of errors? Well, here's a whole bunch of types of errors that you might see. We know that some happen more often than others. This is from some research in the early 90s, but you can see that word errors, morpheme errors, and phoneme errors are a lot more common than any of these other errors. So, like a sentence error, you don't usually have, which means like you said an entire sentence you didn't mean to say. A very uncommon error. I've never done that. I've never said an entire sentence I didn't mean to say. Words, yeah. You've listened to my podcasts, you know. Like an entire sentence seems like you probably noticed it. A phrase doesn't happen very often, but somewhat. And I think this is kind of interesting to think about. So some of the research on this shows that a reason why phrases may have errors with them is because they're kind of like they're more cliched phrases. They're like turns of phrase that you use a lot. So flip a coin or something like that. Or on the other hand, something where these words go together, and yes, they are individual words, but we might conceptualize each of these turns of phrase almost as their own word. On the other hand means exactly the same thing as however. So it's possible that we conceptualize of this entire group of words, of these four words, as the same thing as the single word however. Like the notion may be the same. We know it's a synonym. How can a synonym for however be four words? Well, it is. So it's possible that these phrase errors, again, some researchers think that the phrase errors, the reason why those seem a little bit, that's like the next group that's highest after word, morpheme, and phoneme, is because there are some phrases that we get wrong that we kind of treat cognitively like words. Okay, so word errors, morpheme errors, and phoneme errors. We've talked about these a lot, but let's try to put them in with everything else that we've learned. So, language comes together. We've got the, what you're seeing here is kind of like what happens. I see banana, two bananas, an entire bushel of bananas, and I'm just kind of like overcome with love. We're at the conceptual stage. These you can't tell; they're kind of like grayed out on this background. They just kind of look like it's a darker color blue, but it's supposed to be sort of grayed out. So like we're in the conceptual stage, and it's kind of just like ooh, hunger and deliciousness, and I see a banana. Then we get to the lemma, and I start to choose word notions like I love banana, and then we're going to select the correct morphemes for grammar based on just the idea of like two-ness. There's multiple bananas, it's not just one. So I'll throw an S on there as well. Um, and then we're going to move to the lexeme form, where I'm actually choosing the pre-articulatory forms of these words. I love and bananas. We're going to choose those words, and then there we go. Then we're going to say the words. Okay, so how can we have some of these issues? I might say I love pears, and what's happened here is I chose the wrong word. I made a word error. Um, banana isn't really similar to a pear, but a banana isn't really similar to anything. It's fantastic on its own, and not on its own. It's fantastic in all forms. Um, it would be really disgusting on a steak, I guess. Like the combination. Neither of the things in here are inherently are like disgusting alone, but then the idea of just like putting a banana on a steak seems wrong. In a taco, like a banana taco, you could make a dessert taco, which would be good, but if you also had ground beef in it, that would be not ideal. Anyway, you know, whatever. Tacos I don't like. Uh, but the error that I might make here is because banana and pear could be related to one another. Uh, to me, for some, like it's not, but you could imagine that it would be for somebody. These are both fruits, I guess. And so the word error occurs at the lemma level, like the notion is for some reason co-activated. If I think that bananas are very similar to pears, pear and peach you might have people that do something like this. Pear and apple, you might have people that would confuse those. So like they just kind of like switch the notion. What's interesting about this is when this happens, you can tell that it's at this lemma level where we have syntax because nouns are usually almost always swapped with nouns, verbs are swapped with verbs. But it's not like you have like a noun that's swapped with a verb. That doesn't happen. So we're already selecting the part of speech. There's already syntax information. So we're in the lemma level. We're getting syntax information, but for some reason the word gets switched out. Oh, um, word errors usually are related words. We've talked about this a lot. They're usually synonyms, they're antonyms, or for some other reason they're highly related. Like pear could be highly related with banana to a person that only, you know, for some reason thinks that they're very similar. They might almost be synonyms. They wouldn't be synonyms because it's not like a banana and a plantain, although I think there's probably a difference there. Um, Plantains are less sweet, right? They're bigger. And I've never bought a one that's ripe because I don't know what to look for. I try. Anyway, so word errors usually come from highly related words. This is probably a co-activated node or basin that gets selected instead of the intended word. So pear is for some reason highly co-activated. Maybe the person's been eating a lot of pears. They already think bananas and pears are similar. They've been eating a lot of pears, and then they say, "Oh, I love pears." Well, it wasn't a pear. Sorry. Morphological error. We've talked about these a lot too, but you might say, "I loves banana." And what's happened here is that the morphological error has occurred when you have the correct root words are chosen, but for some reason the tag that you're using, these morphemes, move to a different word. It should be I love bananas, but for some reason the plural tag has moved to a different word. This isn't 100% the most typical here. I loves banana wouldn't be typical. You would maybe see this if you were saying, wear your hat and shoes. You might say wear your hats and shoe because, again, we have access to this lexical information at the lemma level, and the tag for plural is going to go with noun. And so it's more unlikely that it would end up with loves, the verb, than it would with a different noun. I just didn't have a noun in the sentence, but they tend to stay with the same type of word. Morphological error, of course, can also be if you said something like wonderly instead of wonderful, you put uh, the wrong inflectional tag on there, the wrong inflectional morpheme. It means the same thing. It's just that wonderly is not a word, but you know, if it was, it would mean the same thing as wonderful. Um, okay, and then you can have a title on this is supposed to say phonological error. You can say I loves Lanana, which is a phonological error. A phoneme is added, deleted, or replaced. In this case, it's been duplicated from loves. I loves Lanana. And what's going on here is we've just sent the motor idea to the articulators. Uh, the ol sound has been it's kind of like prepotent now. It's already there. I loves Lanana. So it gets used again. Okay, so now we're going to move to understanding speech. This is where all this stuff, we're pulling all the stuff that we learned together here to explain the errors and how the words come together. They fall down in these building blocks and these errors can occur. They happen more often than we think. There's actually some really cool research that I didn't put in here. I should have, but I was anticipating not talking about it. Anyway, it's okay if the video is 2 minutes longer than I anticipated it being. The research shows that you go back, you look at speeches or interviews or anything like that, so anything that's off the cuff and not rehearsed, and you listen to it slowly, you can count up all of the errors that are made. And then you can also ask someone who watched this in real time or listened to it in real time how many errors there were. We miss about 50% of the errors. Uh, And I think when we're really engrossed in whatever it is that we're listening to, we miss even more. But we're definitely missing about 50% of the actual speech errors that we make. Wrong words are used, the words are used, the morphemes are used in the wrong place. Um, Phonological errors happen, sounds are duplicated or not put in, and we just don't catch these. One of the reasons is we know what we're expecting to hear, so sometimes we just can't hear it. And then other times when the errors are caught, sometimes people aren't exactly sure what the error was. They'll just say, "Oh, they said that wrong," and then for some reason they can't figure out what it was. It's because again we're filling in what the word must have actually been. We know that there was a problem with it, but because we filled in what it is, it's difficult for us to pinpoint the problem. And that leads us to understanding speech. So we've talked about this a lot, but understanding speech uh, or writing is all just building probabilities. That doesn't mean that's not true for when we're talking. It is true when we're talking. We are building probabilities when we're talking. One of the ways that we select the words that we want to use is with something like an attractor basin, just like this. But when we're listening, we're definitely, or reading, experiencing language in any form, we're definitely building these probabilities of like where the information is going. I say information because it's not just where the sentence is going. Sometimes it's also where the word is going. So as we start to hear phonemes being produced, we're expecting where the word is going to go. That's why we're not as good at hearing the errors as I was going to say as we should be, but that's why we're not great at hearing the errors. When we're reading something, we've talked about saccades. We're always looking ahead and kind of like predicting where the word is going to go. One of the reasons why it's hard for us to figure out, to notice that words are misspelled sometimes is because we're building up this probability of where the word is going to go. So we're always building probabilities. Or you can think of it as attractor basins, right? So here's two different versions of what an attractor basin is like. This is kind of from the side. And then this is like from the top view. And there's one marble in there that's for some reason here got pushed out. It's trying to decide what the meaning of a sentence is, and it's going to go one of two ways. It's either going to go over here to this meaning, or it's going to come over here to this meaning. And then we also think about things in terms of word trees. Like some words are highly connected to others. Um, Car and drive are highly connected. But then you can think about that as like branching activation from there. You've got car, you've got drive, you've got maybe driver's license after that. You've got DMV that comes up from driver's license. You've got board that comes up from DMV. You've got what comes up yawn from board. You've got sleep that comes up from yawn. You've got bed. You've got sheet. Um, you've got comfortable. And so somehow you've gone from DMV to comfortable, which no way, man. Like you'd never connect those two. There's so many leaps to get there, but this is kind of how we uh, conceptualize language. And this is the same kind of structure that's used to build things like Chat GPT or whatever the other one is called. What's the other one called? Bing Talker. I don't know. Something like that. The one that Bing's making. Microsoft talks a lot. Something. Whatever. It doesn't matter. But the same kind of structure is used to build these. Actually, it was used to build the early versions of them. I think now they've moved on to neural networks with a lot of hidden layers. It's difficult to tell what each of the nodes are doing. My assumption is it's doing something a lot like these word trees here. But sometimes it's difficult to tell with the way that the models are trained up what what is actually happening. In that way, it is very similar to a brain because you don't really know what each individual neuron is doing. You can tell that it's active for some things, but what information does it actually contain? Anyway, whatever the case is, we're building expectations of a sentence as we experience it, or a word, or whatever it is. So we've got then ambiguous sentences. Remember these? So we've got, I saw James in my pajamas. Well, this is a problem because we're not sure which person was in my pajamas. Was it me or was it James? Was I walking around in my pajamas and I'm like, oh, James? Or was I walking around totally normal clothes and there's James? Why is he wearing my pajamas? Whole bunch of reasons why that might be. So we can't tell. And the reason for this is just because that structure is ambiguous. We could disambiguate it with more words, um, or another sentence or something like that, but it's an ambiguous sentence, like we talked about. We're not sure which noun phrase that in goes with. Does it go with I, or does it go with James? There's no probability. There's no better probability for which one to go with. I and James are both equally probable, and so it's difficult to understand. If you go with something more obvious, like I shot an elephant in my pajamas, uh, you assume clearly I'm wearing my pajamas. And then the rest of that, the punchline to that joke, that Groucho Marx joke, is how he got in my pajamas. I have no idea. Um, it's a great joke. It's one of my favorite linguistics jokes. There's more. Um, they're all kind of they're super like dad joke material. But anyway, um, the joke works because it is ambiguous, but it's ambiguous in a way that you almost don't realize it's ambiguous. I shot an elephant in my pajamas. There's no way that the elephant's going to be wearing your pajamas. It's not something elephants do. And so then you get to the punchline and you realize, oh, the sentence does work that way. And that's kind of where the joke comes from, obviously. Okay, garden path sentences. These are also related. Um, they're also ambiguous, but in a different way. While I was eating a sandwich, hit me in the face. When you see it written out, clearly there's a grammatical error that would help disambiguate the sentence. But when you just hear it, while I was eating a sandwich, hit me in the face. Well, it's kind of confusing. And the reason is, while I was eating a sandwich, that part right there led us down a path to expect the comma after sandwich and to hear that something happened while I was eating a sandwich. So, like this right here, while I was eating a sandwich, there's a high probability of that clause holding together. As we're experiencing the sentence while I, and then we're like, was is probably going to come up. So, while I was, yes, eating. Okay, so next we're going to hear about what they were eating, a sandwich. Good. And now this clause is done, and they're going to tell me what happened while they're eating the sandwich. Then what sounds like the clause of what happened while they were eating a sandwich is hit me in the face, which is, it makes no sense. It makes no sense. And so we have to go back and try to figure out, well, wait a second, how did I misunderstand that so terribly? And then you realize, oh, the separation must have been while I was eating a sandwich hit me in the face. Again, like I said, written out like this, there should be a comma that would disambiguate this. It's either after eating, or we're expecting it's after sandwich, but it should be after eating. But when you hear it said, uh, it works a bit better as a garden path sentence. This is true for all of the garden path sentences. They hang together in a way. The old man, this all works. We know about old men. They're always doing crazy stuff. The boat, hang on a second. Let me go back and try to figure out what I was talking about. Okay, so just kind of a review, an overview of how all the concepts that we've learned come together into creating language and understanding language. Mostly we've talked about spoken language because that most of you are going to be SLPs, so that's what you need to know about. But this all works for written language as well. Um, Now, I say a review. I don't mean that it is the review that you're going to need for your exam. This is actually just kind of like a review of the knowledge put together for you. This is what you're going to need to take with you into other classes. This is what you're going to need to take with you into your profession to know where the words are coming from and how people are responding to these. Um, why the kinds of errors that happen. And possibly you can use that knowledge to help people overcome some errors if they have those problems a lot. If you have somebody like that Dr. Spooner guy who makes all those Spoonerisms and they uh, don't want to make those errors all the time, you can try to use this information to remedy that problem. So, again, don't only watch this instead of the reviews for the exam, also watch the reviews for the exam. Make sure that you know everything on those for the exam, but this could also help you on the exam. Probably should, probably will. But it's also just to know the knowledge uh, that you can take with you out to the future.